Afternoon, everybody. Jock Reynolds here again to welcome you to yet another wonderful lecture by John Walsh. And I wanted to say, checking my weather app on my phone, we've had an increase of temperature of over 40 degrees in the last week. And as the first harbinger of spring, this eager robin has just appeared in our midst from the West Coast to regale us again. John, it's always wonderful when you're in our midst to offer forth your wonderful lectures. And in this last fall and now this winter and then again next fall to come, John has invited, as you know, some of the other great experts on Dutch painting, particularly the Dutch painting of the Golden Age, to come and lecture here. And in the fall, as you know, we led off with 2 wonderful lectures, followed by 4 from esteemed colleagues. Today he's here to share a lecture with us, and then for the next 4 Fridays at 1:30, beginning tomorrow with Nicholas Sutar, one of our wonderful art historians, you will hear lectures by other colleagues. And again, this is in concert with the second installation of great Dutch works drawn from the Van Otterloo collection from Eyck and Rosemarie. I'm happy to say that the Van Otterloos have agreed to let us have the 3rd state of their collection, including their great Rembrandt painting. That will be coming here with other works from the collection in May. Larry Cantor will install those in the galleries upstairs, and in the fall, John will yet again be back here and with another great lineup. So, and those of you who are Wordle gallery teachers out there in the audience who've been awaiting John's arrival, and many of our students, you too are deeply grateful that he's back in our midst. John, please come up and deliver your lecture.
Thank you, Jock. Let me begin with the 2 artists in my title, Jan van der Cappelle and Jacob van Ruisdael, and admit right off that nobody invented atmosphere. I mean, it's always been there. It's the envelope of air we live in, but we use atmosphere figuratively too, to mean the feelings and the moods induced by the look of things. I mean, when we look at landscape painting and talk about its atmosphere, what we mean is the sky, the weather conditions, the light, and so forth. And we're apt to use emotional terms to describe how they strike us: peaceful, calm, euphoric, or ominous, oppressive, turbulent, across a whole spectrum of affects. Those affects are part of the reason Dutch landscape was so numerous in the 17th century and so popular. People found them in some way refreshing to the spirit. Many of their owners saw the countryside as an antidote to the poisons of city life. And that's been a theme in literature since Pliny and pastoral poetry in antiquity. For many Dutch people, landscapes were reminders of God's creation, his power, his benevolence. One writer spoke of seeing God's goodness from the top of every dune. The Dutch could also take pride in pictures of what they themselves had made, the land that they had reclaimed from the sea, and the sea that they had conquered with their ships. And landscape paintings were made as objects to be admired and wondered at the feat by the artist of using oil paint to give the illusion of looking at places, but also looking at conditions of weather and light, specific conditions, credible, changeable, subtle, dramatic, atmosphere. Dutch painters took those conditions, which had mostly served as a backdrop in painting, and made them an enveloping presence in the picture, even a leading presence. Now, to do that required a new kind of virtuosity, and we'll see how Dutch painters developed that. In the painting by Ruisdael, not much is happening. You can barely make out people here and there. What hits you is the light from the afternoon sun that makes long shadows as it slants through, making the edges of the higher clouds bright, while the clouds closer to the earth are dark, inky black at the top. They form a great curve that echoes the riverbank and the arc of the ruts as they recede. Well, what makes the clouds curve? Well, we can see from the chimney smoke here that the wind is blowing gently from the west, the prevailing wind, to judge from the lean of the trees. The smoke from a solitary house seems to feed that vast plume above. So these things are adding up to more than just a picture of a particular place outside Amsterdam. They're evoking great forces, forces of change, the cold of winter, the brevity of the day, and in the dark clouds, the possibility of storm and snow. In the blue sky, the chance of clearing and sun. In the tumble-down farm building, there's evidence of survival through effort. All of this is expressed in picture language that's expressive, even vehement. Well, with Jan van de Cappelle, it's again the sky that strikes us first, that astonishing cloud formation, kind of horizontal over at the left, rising up in the center where the nearest boat is, going through a range of grays and breaking up, while just below, another formation hovers above the ship in the distance. And look at the proportions of land to sky. The land gets less than a quarter of the picture. There are spectators, well-dressed city people who've come for the bracing air and, we feel, a kind of euphoric spectacle at the sea. They're stand-ins for us. They're admiring the scene just as the artist wanted us to admire his picture of them admiring the scene. After this little overture, I'll first back up 3 centuries and remind you of earlier steps that artists took towards creating atmospheric outdoor spaces, spaces that begin to look something like what we actually experience in nature. The medieval color code prescribed gold for the sky. On the back of Duccios's great altarpiece with scenes from the life of Christ, there's sky above the figures, rendered by the most splendid and enduring material of all, gold. The gold sky has no more to do with nature than the gold halos do, which are abstractions, emblems of sanctity, and made of the same material as the heavens above. Duccios's contemporary from Florence, Giotto, was busy painting the walls of a chapel in Padua and creating a new world of illusion, a simple space with a blue vault of heaven overhead, and the story of Christ's life and death taking place in front of a blue sky. Blue, the air we breathe, a substance that appears to support hovering angels even. It recedes behind the figures and the rocks, helping to create the illusion of a space where these weighty people who overlap each other are not just symbols, but part of the real world of gravity that we live in. More than a century later, another Florentine, Masaccio, takes landscape farther towards credibility. The figures are solidly planted on the ground, and they cast shadows. They're put in an illusionary space on the right here, with mountains in the distance, a distance that we feel we could walk into, maybe along the lake on the left side. It's a grave, stony setting for a serious story of Christ's ministry. And above those mountains hang flat clouds that we easily read as end on, seen foreshortened. So there's a believable condition of atmosphere here. The late afternoon sun slanting in and casting shadows on the hills behind. Almost simultaneously, at the Burgundian court, 3 Lambour brothers were painting miniatures in a book of hours for the Duc de Berry. There had never before been pictures of the world as vivid as these, as painstaking in their details, or as believable in their images of the work of the seasons. The sky is a sullen gray in January, as we know. The light is flat here, and you believe that it's cold here, and the fire is warm. The picture for October has a warm, mild light that's good for working, and it's even better for strolling around the Duke's great castle. In both pictures, The sky is persuasive, especially in the October, where it's light blue at the horizon and then darkens up to a brilliant blue, kind of indigo, higher up. And that observation puts in one of the first appearances in art here. Jan van Eyck paints a vast landscape in the background of his painting of the Madonna and Child being worshipped by the wealthy Chancellor Nicolas Rolin. Behind Rolin, there's a small town, and behind the Queen of Heaven, a vast, fabulous Gothic city. Beyond that, the river winds far into the distance toward a wall of blue-gray mountains. That amazing bird's-eye view was influential. Flemish artists made it a specialty of theirs, and they painted variations on it for another century and a half. Artists in Venice learned to paint narrative scenes in outdoor settings with mountains and towns and cities, and they have a distinctive personality, these landscapes. We can begin to speak of atmosphere in them. Giovanni Bellini produced something really new and dramatic, a sunset that lights up the cloud bank here from below. And it casts a golden light on everything. That light, of course, signals the presence of God and embodies a benediction. In the case of Bellini's St. Francis, benediction comes as the gift of Christ's wounds transmitted to Francis's own hands and feet by a miracle. We don't see the usual seraph and rays implanting those things on his hands and feet. What we have to do is imagine them as light itself that comes from high up on the left, which is signaled by these clouds that are shredded and emitting yellow light. And that light gives a warm tint to everything, everywhere, on the hill town, on the pasture behind, and even exploring every crevice on the green rocks. Well, by contrast to all this, clear air is what you find in paintings of Raphael and other Central Italian painters of the Renaissance. Nothing like colored light or atmospheric drama. His placid Madonnas here and his wrenching entombment are both set in gentle landscapes with the same kind of blue sky and puffy clouds in the far distance. It's in Venice where artists go on exploring other possibilities, among other things, that the setting could be much more than a setting. It could have a kind of speaking role, as eloquent and mysterious as the actors and what they're doing. Well, Giorgione's painting is still a puzzle, despite centuries of attempts to figure out what the subject is. He may have intended it that way. X-rays actually show that originally there was another nude woman standing where the man is, which definitely complicates matters. A storm is gathering in the background, where there are dark clouds and a bolt of lightning. It's weirdly calm as the woman suckles a baby and a young man in contemporary costume looks on. This St. Jerome in Penitence was painted a dozen or so years earlier on the other side of the Alps. Now the landscape nearly fills up the picture. It's almost the subject of the picture. And up above, the sky speaks of the human subject, that is Jerome's self-mortification, with a blazing banner of blood-red cloud, like a flag. And like a flag, it doesn't affect the color or the clarity of the landscape that spreads out underneath it. That's as sharp and bright as Van Eyck's was. It stretches back to a vast distance and spreads out past the edges of the central panel and into the wings, which show two other ascetic saints, St. John the Baptist and St. Anthony, being tormented by devils. It's one great panorama of civilized and wild nature, a kind of picture for which the Germans invented the term world landscape, Weltlandschaft, that was tremendously admired and imitated all over Europe. Here's the victory of the Macedonians under Alexander the Great over the Persians, led by Darius II, as described by Plutarch, in a painting that's about 6 feet high, commissioned by the Duke of Bavaria. Tens of thousands of men are reduced to tiny dots as the battle and the day are about to end. It's the sunset of Persian power. The message of the sky is clear. Alexander's victory is certain, as sure as night follows day. Altdorfer was evidently the first artist to paint pure landscape, to free nature from its exclusive role as a backdrop or a setting, to excuse the actors entirely and present it as empty of human presence. This little painting is all about the Danube and a few local monuments near Regensburg, and also about a certain condition of clear air and setting suns and puffy clouds, not in the background, but high overhead, with the effect of including us spectators in the space that's depicted. Now, it's true the clouds are schematic, but the sense is strong that we're seeing a real place at an actual time of day and time of year. A little before this time, Netherlandish painters were producing pictures with some very sophisticated special effects, as we call them out where I live. These are 2 small night scenes with amazing light, just moonlight in the case of Jan Gossart's Agony in the Garden on the left, and the light of burning cities, the cities of the plain, in a painting by Patenier, whose panorama with St. Jerome you just saw a moment ago. With the landscapes of Peter Bruegel the Elder, we can actually speak of atmosphere in the sense that we find it painted by the Dutch artists 60 years later. I mean attempts to observe and depict weather conditions in light that pervades the entire picture space. The famous examples are the pictures Bruegel made of the activities of the seasons, of which 5 have survived. This one of late winter shows the cutting of willow shoots and the eating of carnival waffles and other traditional details of the activities of the season. Season's right about now, by the way. Bruegel put it all into a chilly setting where the trees are bare, the wind whips up the river, which is littered with small ships in danger. The wind propels the clouds forward, and they've already delivered snow to the mountains, you see, now a lot more convincingly than anything we've been seeing before. Bruegel had crossed the Alps himself on the way to Italy and back again, and he knew what he was painting. In this picture, one you all know, we'd usually talk first about the wheat harvesting going on and the lunch break, but in this context, the painting stands out for its blonde and golden tonality, and especially for the haze that hangs over the distant sea and land, which we recognize as humid summer air. It's evidently overcast because we hardly see any shadows cast on the ground at all. With Bruegel, we're very close to the ideas that the Dutch would be exploiting in the next century. Well, I want to return for a moment to Venice in Bruegel's time, where the reigning genius was Titian. Titian's atmospheric effects are at their most gorgeous in a few of the pictures that he painted in his 70s, when he was 70, for the King of Spain, especially this one. Jupiter, disguised as a bull, is carrying off the Princess Europa. She's been pulled away from her companions over there on the far shore, the world that she's leaving for a new life. She protests, but her body language suggests that she'll be open to Jupiter at some point later on. Would the picture be as seductive if the action took place in the clear, bright light of morning? I don't think so. The warmth here, the atmosphere, suggests passion, which begets life. And Titian's broad, impulsive style of painting embodies the ardent action of the subject. Here's another abduction, the last, I promise you. Also Italian, with nothing of the heated atmosphere of Titian, but it has a deep landscape behind, another world landscape, and a sky that's dark above with big stormy clouds right over where Pluto carries Proserpina towards his waiting chariot. And nature is in sync with this. The clouds draw attention to the violent action and they accentuate it. There's a kind of color coding here, too. Dark foreground, yellow middle ground, green farther back, and finally, in the distance, blue. Color is zoned. And this becomes a kind of arbitrary convention that carries right into the 17th century, as we'll see in a minute. Well, we can't talk about atmosphere in landscape without looking at this very familiar portrait of Toledo, which is strangely backlighted, spectral, with a tremendous turbulent sky. It seems to express a condition rather than a story, perhaps something about the splendor of the city framed by nature, and of course for the devout El Greco, perhaps something about the presence and the favor of God. The color coding I just mentioned became a common property in Europe. It was how landscape was expected to look. And like a lot of other arbitrary devices of the late 16th century, the period of so-called mannerism, those zones were reused by many artists. The very successful Flemish painter Paul Brill, who made a career in Rome, adopted them for his small sort of world landscapes on copper, like this one. It's just a foot wide, of St. Jerome, again in a fanciful wilderness that has a sequence of tan, green, blue receding into the high and distant horizon. The air is perfectly clear. Whatever atmosphere we can speak of is way off in the distance. Artists of this generation began to paint another kind of landscape subject, closer to home. This is Peter Bruegel's son, Jan Bruegel, a painting of the same small size, with an ordinary riverbank teeming with people being ferried across. The river flows past towns and villages far back into the distance, its colors changing according to the familiar formula. Sky lighted by a yellow sun, here that's masked from our view. And Jan Bruegel treated his clients to a whole catalog of very specific ordinary activities of the country, just as his father had, but with a marvelous exactness on a minuscule scale. Within 20 years, landscape painting in the Netherlands had an entirely different look. The viewpoint came right down to the eye level of somebody actually in the scene. The horizon dropped accordingly. The sky takes up 3/4 of the picture, giving space for a tremendous cloud formation, not the linear, wispy clouds of the later 16th century, but instead fat, fluffy, swelling clouds that echo the general shape of the buildings and the trees below. The color scheme has changed too. Instead of the successive layers of beige and green and blue, there's just brown and yellow ochre and silvery gray. And instead of strong light-dark contrasts, the value scale has closed up, creating a pervading general tonality. Well, where does this come from all of a sudden, this interest in ordinary down-home places, this ability to create a sky full of real-looking clouds, and the illusion of light softened by moist air? Well, first, the ordinary scenery. Salomon van Ruisdael, this artist, worked in Haarlem, where a taste had developed for pictures of the surrounding countryside. Now, some of the impetus may have come from the much older biographer and theoretician, Karel van Mander, in a poem addressed to young artists, in which he urges them to wake up early, get going, get out in the country, and draw. Van Mander's colleague in Haarlem, Hendrik Goltzius, was already doing that, as you see from a pen drawing at the top of 1604, made in the dunes outside the city. He matched the plainness of the view with a kind of straightforward pen style that he used for it. In the middle, Willem Buitenweg, a generation younger, his drawings and etchings made the canals and the rivers and the very ordinary dirt roads look interesting and, in their way, beautiful. There was a great boom in the production of small, cheap printed pictures, like this one at the bottom, an etching by Esaias van der Velde. And you notice in all three of these, there isn't much sky to be seen. It took oil paint to represent the sky, the weather, the atmosphere. It also took a strong example, which came in the 1620s in the work of an older artist in Haarlem, Jan Porcellus. Porcellus was exclusively a sea painter, but he had a lot to offer landscape painters. In the 1620s, he was composing pictures like this of ordinary small vessels going about their unglamorous work. You don't know where you are, since there aren't any landmarks on shore. What must have been stunning to other painters is that the sky takes up 3/4 of the picture and that the clouds are so powerful. At the left, they're dark and threatening, but the little ships are forging on, sailing close-hauled into the chop. And the diagonal slant here of the cloud formation reinforces the heel of the vessels and the masts. So this is the ordinary life of everyday small commercial shipping in Holland, and the prominent Dutch flag makes that obvious. And on the horizon, barely visible, on the horizon at the far right, there's the gray silhouette of a large three-masted merchantman gliding downwind, a reminder that shipping is not just a small business in this country. The Dutch are a great power at sea the world over. Porcellus painted actually much worse weather than this. Storms were a subject that Dutch buyers evidently like to contemplate in the comfort of home. These are two of them, both accentuating the action on board, the heavy rolling and pitching, and the wind that's caused the crews to scramble to reduce sail. At the bottom, there are rocks. At the top, rather, there are rocks here at the right that spell mortal danger. And down below, men are having trouble with the sail. This kind of picture of ships in peril with atmosphere to make the skin crawl and with a cold, gray, hostile tonality gave the owners plenty to think about during a century of long sea voyages by intrepid Dutch traders and Navy men. The most famous of these pictures is probably this one by Willem van der Velde the Younger, nearly a century later. It takes the idea in the Porcellus, the sudden emergency, a reversal of fortune, you could say, and adds a tremendous sky full of clouds that slant with the roll of the ships. Porcellus's clouds were picked up quickly by Haarlem painters and put to work. They went for simple, anonymous locations like this road up here on the right in the dunes near Haarlem. They put their compositions into kind of dynamic balance by using big, emphatic clouds like the dark one here that kind of echoes the shape of the tree, and the white cloud here that sort of speaks to the patch of light on the road. In later paintings, the sky completely dominates, but often it's all clouds without even a patch of blue. It's all tone, too, gray above, brown below. The only color here is the Dutch flag. There's hardly enough breeze to go anywhere, and there's nothing much happening, just men rowing and others bringing cargo aboard. The picture gets all its visual energy from that stripe of light here that wipes across the foreground and the chop. You could hardly get more ordinary. In the Van Goyen picture upstairs here at the lower left, we get a similar sky. But as plausible as it looks, notice that the clouds don't come forward over us, but they stay back, perhaps moving from left to right, conceivably from right to left. Is it the other way around? We don't know. There's a slash of light across the foreground, the middle ground, like the one in Porcellus. Again, nobody does much. They stand around. Man at the left picks up a piece of wood. The action is in the sky and in the slanting light. At the same time, Salomon van Ruisdael goes for more striking effects of light, derived from Porcellus, related to Van Goyen. In this case, a huge plume of cloud seems to rise up on a diagonal, evidently blown in from the sea, backlighted, and in places echoing the shape of the trees. Whether skies are plain or fancy, whether plain in the Van Goyen you just saw, and fancy here in the Van Ruisdael, clouds are a major element in the design of the picture, in its composition. That isn't new. You saw that going back all the way to Bellini. With that in mind, I want to look at just a few more adventuresome designs. For instance, look at the other Porcellus hanging upstairs. He's built something striking out of clouds, two huge, tall towers that divide the picture. Beneath them, ships sail in different directions. And there's a humble rowboat with fishermen working away in the exact center. A very untypical composition. Bending down to touch them is a rainbow, something we don't find in many paintings. This is a case where I'm sure Dutch spectators would have seen nothing less than God's grace touching them. They knew that passage in Genesis, where after the flood, a rainbow appeared as a sign of the covenant between God and humans, who would forever be safe from floods. The sky here and these solemn pillars frame an unusually explicit moral for a landscape. Here the weather has brought other sailors in the background to a bad end. The smaller fisher vessels at the left, the ones that work closer to land, they're fine, and they're being unloaded. The sun has come out and lighted them up, as well as the spectators in their city clothes. As for the seagoing three-masters that are foundering in the storm, they have attempted more, sailed farther, and they lose more, including life itself for some of them. Others are being saved. There's a rescue going on. The atmosphere isn't just threatening, it's death-dealing. The picture was certainly intended to provoke thought about ambition and its price, and about human frailty. A couple of years later, Simon de Vlieger reassembles beach and columnar clouds, things we've seen, in an entirely unthreatening picture. The beach sparkles with sun. The backlit clouds are radiant. And there's a sense here of well-being that we saw at the beginning in the picture by Jan van de Cappelle, where work goes on under a great climbing, undulating, silvery cloud of melting beauty that poses no threat. It seems a pure embodiment of benevolent kind of equilibrium of sea and land and air and water, all experienced by the people in the picture who are our stand-ins. Well, in this chain of beach scenes, you see a pictorial idea passed down from one artist to another and given new kinds of atmosphere and gaining new possibilities. Van de Cappelle was the painter who saw the greatest possibilities in calm weather. Here again, nothing much going on beyond a bit of fishing and drying of sails. But the painter creates a spectacle in the sky that's purely visual, reflected like a mirror in the water. You're tricked into the feeling that you're part of the scene, perhaps standing in the mud flat and breathing the moist atmosphere. Cappelle had already created a new kind of painting with more ships, all equally becalmed, all going nowhere. The crews are drying sails, doing chores. There's just one minor incident. The departure here in the launch on the right of a VIP who rates a cannon salute here from the yacht with the fancy gilding in the center, which belongs to the States General, the governing body of the Dutch Republic. The picture invites the viewer to admire the sheer abundance of shipping. Of course, it's Dutch prosperity incarnate. It's also an invitation to admire the artist's virtuosity. And in some ways, it's kind of a still life. Like a still life painter, he creates a believable space, a lively play of sails, hulls, forms, in other words, and vivid reflections in the water. And the sky is a showpiece, a mix of clouds that rise and swell and gray clouds that seem to come forward up over our heads. Now, this advancing of clouds over us is an effect that Jacob van Ruisdael uses in the painting at the Met that you know, a rush of perspective into the far distance, and then banks of slanting clouds growing as they approach, seeming already to cast a shadow here that we're standing in and to extend up over us. These are summer cumulus clouds swelling with the warm air, and a reminder that there are life-giving forces of sun and rain here that cause the crops to grow. It's another image of prosperity and harmony. Jan van Goyen, here on the left, combined a congested sky, nearly overcast, with a wide-open panoramic view of the flat countryside. The effect, though, is almost sullen. The potential of this kind of panorama was realized fully by Jacob van Ruisdael and in his dozen-odd views of Haarlem, seen from the North Sea dunes. And in these, sky plays the leading role. But the city and the prosperous linen bleaching businesses take their places too. I think Ruisdael wants to suggest that the clouds are beneficial. They bring fresh water for agriculture and for the bleaching trade going on here in the grass. And the pond here underlines the point, because there really wasn't a pond around here at all. Ruisdael invented it and put it in the picture. The other great panorama specialist was Philips Koninck, who invented entire landscapes and gave them atmospheric effects that are sometimes very credible. Like, is it here the march of clouds correctly shown with their flat bases and having a somewhat oppressive effect? Koninck, on the other hand, was capable of wild fantasy. If there's such a thing as a joyous sky, it's this one by Koninck, sky that, clouds that float over another fantasy landscape, fleecy clouds that levitate and seem to exult. You remember that Peter Burkel had introduced very bad weather into landscape, a stormy day here that served as an attribute of late winter. Dutch landscape painters of the 17th century pick up the thread, and they bring the violence home, close to hand. For instance, in this squall by Van Goyen, with an inky sky ripped open by lurid light, with lightning and sheets of rain, sailors scrambling to reduce sail. This is happening in no particular locale. You couldn't identify it. It could be any shallow river in Holland. When Rembrandt takes up landscape painting, he's seldom interested in the contemporary everyday world of Holland that Van Goyen paints. Instead, he invents remote places, vaguely ancient, with fortified hill towns, rushing cascades, turreted towers, water gates, fed by rain from enormous storm clouds overhead. These are places that exist in the imagination at some unspecified past time when we might imagine great deeds were done. In a few wonderful pictures, Rembrandt domesticates the atmospheric drama. Here, a tiny picture with a storm that passes over a canal and a bridge and a village. It seems to be clearing as the light spills down onto the trees, so that the forces that threaten humans also sustain them. To produce his grandest picture of a storm, Rembrandt turned to black and white, the large etching called The Three Trees. The trees are a focal point in a broad panorama of pasture land seen behind a pond in the foreground here, where there's a couple fishing and a pair of lovers deep in the bushes. Detail shows you the lovers in the bushes. And on the hill is a wagon load of people and an artist sitting on the ground sketching. And all this goes on despite angry clouds and slanting rain, which seems to be passing on. I imagine that ever since Beethoven, people have looked at this image and thought of the noisy storm in the Pastoral Symphony that rumbles and crashes and then is succeeded by cheerful tunes. In one famous example, Ruisdael adds explicit symbols. He transplants tombs from the actual Jewish cemetery outside Amsterdam to a wild, hilly place that's threatened by storm clouds. And there's a rainbow again, a symbol of the covenant between God and the human race. The rain that fell from those clouds sluices through the graveyard, the force of life, seeming to promise victory over death. In another of Ruisdael's landscape dramas, weather plays a central role, sharing the stage with the mill, which men have built to grind grain and sustain life. But the mill can't do anything at all without wind, which it doesn't have right now, like the boats becalmed on the river. The wind aloft is blowing tremendous clouds along. I think that Ruisdael is conveying a kind of commonplace moral in Dutch Calvinist thinking about a state of dependency that exists in the world. Humans have used their ingenuity to control the water and to capture the wind, but both things are beyond their control because these things are bestowed or withheld by God. Ruisdael put extra vehemence into winter weather, as you saw at the beginning. But the living things are surviving the cold and the threat of storm, clinging to life. The barren tree at center stage, and people in the ramshackle house with smoke coming out of the chimney. The atmosphere is very different here from earlier winter landscapes. Hendrik Averkamp, for example, who emphasizes the social opportunities that the frozen canal give to all classes, who could go to amuse themselves at skating or show off their fancy clothes, or just spiting the ferries that charge a toll when the river is thawed out, spiting the ferries that are frozen to the bank and taking shortcuts across the water. The model, of course, was Peter Bruegel 60 years earlier. A similar high vantage point, similar atmosphere of bright, sort of squinty overcast. Artists of the next generation make great changes in the weather and the action. Here, for example, it's windy. People hold their hats and their cloaks billow out in the breeze. Clouds in 3 layers signal that the weather is changing. And there's fresh snow in the air, sticking to the trees and to the backs of people. There are a few skaters and fishermen and some games going on, but it's a day for the hardy. What's happened is that a few painters have actually observed the particular varieties of weather in winter and tried to convey the look as well as the sensation of being out in it. And nobody did that better than Ruisdael. I mean, here are the extremes. In both pictures, the amusement park aspect is gone completely. On the left, the canal functions as a road, and the routines of life go on under a dark blanket of cloud. And the other, in the galleries upstairs, in the other there's a sawmill at the right, and you can see that its work has stopped until the river thaws and permits logs to come and timber to go. This picture has a blonde mother of pearl tonality. It's the sun that creates the spectacle. We look right at it, which is extremely unusual. We look right at it, but it's masked by a layer of high cloud whose ice particles reflect its rays up and down. This is an actual meteorological phenomenon called an ice pillar. I learned that from Jessica Sack, who's lived in Wisconsin, where it occasionally occurs. It is a short-lived thing. Ruisdael seizes on it, and it registers on us like a kind of mystical apparition. These winter scenes might suggest that Dutch buyers of landscapes were total masochists. So let me show you some antidotes to winter weather, some other kinds of atmosphere that they also like to look at. Dutch painters did a lot of pictures of places south of the Alps where few Dutch people actually ever went, even rich people. Most of what they knew about Italy came from classical literature and from pictures like these, painted by artists of Van Goyen's generation and then Ruisdael's generation, artists who traveled to Italy. They painted the scenery, the Roman ruins, the feckless peasants, Mediterranean seaports, the foothills of the Alps, and above all, they painted the sun, always there, in pictures at least, in a dependably blue sky and lovely light. This atmosphere lets you dress lightly and not work too hard, as the Dutch imagined it anyway. It is dolce far niente. Some painters from Holland stayed on in Rome, but some came back to the Netherlands and kept painting Italian subjects like these, like Jan Bot here, and Nicholas Berghem, and Adam Peenecker. They were not just observing Italy, they were studying paintings by other artists, especially by the greatest poet of Italian light and atmosphere. The lower left here, the French emigre in Rome, Claude Lorrain. You see one of his idealized landscapes. The qualities of the idyllic pastoral world by Claude or by Dutchmen who'd gone to Italy, those qualities of lemon-colored sunshine and an atmosphere of calm and harmony, those things could be exported, and they actually were. They were recast with Dutch actors and scenery and livestock. That's what Albert Cuyp did. He never traveled south himself. He never saw this kind of thing, but he studied pictures by people who had. His peasants chat with each other as though they were shepherds in Arcadia, but Cuyp puts them beside the rivers near where he lived in Dordrecht, blessed by golden light imported by Italy via pictures. This is art imitating life by imitating art. You're aware of the long reputation that Dutch 17th century art has had for its realism. At this point, you may be wondering, well, how true to actual nature is the atmosphere that artists in the Netherlands have been creating? Well, I've been curious about skies in Dutch landscapes. At one point, a few years ago, I asked myself, what would a meteorologist say about them? I found out quite a lot, together with a professor of atmospheric sciences at UCLA, George Sisko. There are a lot of accurate observations of clouds in Dutch landscape, we found, especially by Jacob van Ruisdael. But there are even more hybrids or fantasies, more impossible clouds. And you can say that for landscapes too. Well-known landmarks are apt to move from one place to another, like the Hooglandse Kerk here in downtown Leiden, which Van Goyen moved to a spot overlooking an imaginary river valley, a setup that never was. Let's take a view by Albert Cuyp of the famous castle up the Rhine, the Valkhof at Nijmegen, up the Rhine toward the German border. This had been quite an important place at one time, and Cuyp exaggerates its height quite a lot. But he paints a perfectly credible setting sun here with the collapsing clouds that are typical of that time of day when the air cools down. This view of the same place has a great, gorgeous set of plumes of cloud being swept along by the breeze aloft. Show this picture to a meteorologist and be prepared for choking noises and a little lecture on the physics of clouds that might go something like this. That is a weird cloud, sort of an impossible stratocumulus. See, he's showing big heads of cumulus, but he's given them tails, like stratus or cirrus clouds. You don't get them together in the same cloud. Cumulus forms during the day when updrafts of warm air rise high enough to condense, forming rounded cells that expand. Stratus and cirrus, on the other hand, occur in layers, just as their name says, layers in air that is settling. Ruisdael and some other painters create their own crossbreed of clouds by combining elements that don't and can't occur together in nature. Speaking of which, the landscape painter who takes liberties with clouds is like the flower painter who pictures a vase with tulips, roses, a carnation, poppies, all in full bloom, whereas in nature they bloom months apart. So there never was such a bouquet. The artist assembled the painting from individual drawings, and although it's completely convincing, you can check upstairs for this one, the 17th century, an anthology of blossoms like this was more true to the richness of nature's gifts than any painted setup of real flowers could be. That's how landscape painters worked. They used poetic license quite freely to create stronger or more beautiful or more typical effects. In the painting at the bottom, here's what my meteorologist friend would call with a smile, good stratocumulus. That's a photograph at the left of the same phenomenon. You notice the flat bases where the clouds form, all at pretty much the same altitude. In the painting by Koning, the clouds behave the way they do in nature, including what they do when we see them above us. From underneath, we actually lose their emphatic flat bases, and they look a lot more irregular. And that's just what inspired painters to take a good deal of liberties. Porcellus at the left, again, a pioneer of the big sky, painting a huge cloud bank that bends forward over the ship as though pushing it along. At the right, Salomon van Ruisdael with two undulating towers, very curious to a meteorologist. Where did these anomalies come from? Not, as you might think, from seeing odd clouds and drawing or painting them on the spot. That just wasn't the practice at this period. Landscapes and seascapes were never painted indoors. Landscapes were all painted indoors, the way this artist is doing, with drawings spread out on the floor to guide him. There are thousands of such drawings by Dutch painters surviving, and almost none of them show clouds. Now here's a whole screen full of drawings by the greatest sky painters of all, artists you've been seeing at the left, leaves from a sketchbook Van Goyen used in his travels, every kind of subject, quickly jotted down. At the top, a panorama by Philips Koning. Down below, two drawings by Jacob van Ruisdael of motives that he used later on for paintings. Paintings that have big, glorious, cloudy skies. What do all these drawings have in common? The skies are empty. So rather than draw cloud formations, I think these artists and others observed the skies and painted them from memory, sometimes inaccurately, for what that's worth. Clouds can be very misleading. When you look at a stratocumulus, those flat bottom clouds that you just saw, from some angles they can look bent, look like they curve upward or sideways. Have a look one of these days out the window. You'll probably see this yourself. This optical distortion can lead painters into some strange-looking formations like the one on the left. Well, there can be another explanation for these odd clouds. the artists used a formula, a template. Here's a very brief case history. Two landscapes by Jacob van Ruisdael have a strange stratocumulus trailing a tail and branching into a bunch of puffy heads. Did he see a cloud like that in nature? Very doubtful. Well, where did he get it, I wondered. So I went on a quest, and I found the source in a picture, an engraving that reproduces a composition by Rubens, much the most famous Netherlandish artist of the era, with a lofty branching cloud that would have been suggestive for artists. So I kept going, and I found more of them. I found them from the Vatican to the Villa Mazère by Veronese, to the workshop of Hendrik Vroom in Haarlem. I discovered that this motif, this cloud, was a motif used by many artists, no matter how exactly it was transmitted to Jacob van Ruisdael. And I believed I'd proved my point. The trouble is that a previously unknown oil sketch by John Constable appeared at Sotheby's not long ago. And that was trouble because Constable wasn't making these clouds up. He was painting studies like this out of doors, and he noted the place and time of day. So, odd-shaped clouds, almost like Ruisdael's, were, and probably are still, actually up there now and then, exaggerated maybe, but close enough in shape to shoot down my motif thesis. We've seen how landscape painters like Cuyp and Ruisdael and others use clouds not just to be beautiful in themselves or to create atmosphere, but to reinforce the action going on in the picture. And we've seen the weather convey familiar poetic or scriptural metaphors, storms, rainbows, sunshine, rain. I want to show you two paintings by Nicholas Berchem in which the clouds are what we might call natural metaphors, as distinct from metaphors in the literary or scriptural sense. I'll say what I mean. On the left, oxen and farmers are shown plowing a field, straining up a hill and expending a lot of effort, while behind them a huge cumulus cloud looms up, but at a much lower altitude than actually occurs in nature. It's expanding in the sunlight. Now, everybody in Berchem's time knew this kind of cloud long before it had a Latin name, and every scientific writer from Aristotle on had described this process of its formation. That cloud, energetically growing, is the perfect companion to a kinetic human activity here. It would have been understood, I think, as a kind of meteorological commentary on it. In the other picture, peasants in the ruins of the Roman Campania, the sky and the clouds have another kind of function, another kind of comment to make. The cloud overhead is a formation that we've seen, typical of late afternoon. It's decaying as the air cools and the light declines. Earlier the day it had swelled up and the sun, now its energy is gone and it has a different kind of beauty. The daily history of clouds was part of everybody's experience, the artist and his audience alike. They knew clouds at this stage of life, and I think they surely saw this slow, lovely collapse as reinforcing the idea of ancient buildings and mighty civilizations as victims to time and change. Finally, I'm going to just remind you quickly that skies and atmosphere had a glorious future in painting. Dutch pictures were the inspiration and the model for many 18th century artists, especially in England with Gainsborough, and in France with Fragonard. One product of the great wave of curiosity and empirical observation of nature in the early 19th century was Constable's studies of sky and atmosphere. At first, though, he painted skies in the studio, but then came 2 summers of outdoor sketching that expanded his vocabulary, and he observed and painted And this made him confident when it came to very Dutch-looking panoramas, like this one at the bottom. And he was just as confident with grand statements, such as his 6-foot-wide picture of Salisbury Cathedral and a passing storm. Nature, you could say, seen through Ruisdael's imagery and brought atmospherically, meteorologically up to date. The last great repercussion of Dutch invention of atmosphere came in pictures that were mostly painted out of doors, sky and all, as John Singer Sargent showed Monet doing. Sky and landscape painted together, one unified picture. Paintings both true and subtle, whether they're pleasant or brooding, thanks in good part to the believable skies and the tinted air and the changeable moods that are the legacy of Dutch 17th century painters. Thank you.